Excellent. Okay, so we're going to be talking about developing risk-based strategies through scenarios. So we've heard quite a little bit here about the current situation, COVID, and so forth. And what I really want to do is say, okay, well, how do we take things forward? Now, a lot of organizations at the moment are needing to really consider, what are we doing as a business? We've now had a lockdown and a lot of companies are struggling. So most businesses are now looking at, how do we adapt and reinvent? How can we diversify and maybe transform our business model? In order to do that, we need to manage and take risk. It's important to consider taking risk, but before you can take risk, you have to understand what the risks are in order to survive and thrive. And this means developing a new business model. It means developing a new strategy, new business plan. But without the risk information, you don't have the full picture to do this, because you need the risks to make an effective decision, understand the pitfalls that may be ahead and prepare for them, and be able to properly compare options that you have. If you've got two business plans that you're proposing, how are you going to see which one is the best one if you haven't considered the risks? And how are you going to turn risk into opportunity? Like the goldfish there jumping out of that little bowl into another bowl, needs to understand what's ahead of him before he can actually do that. Just before I really get into what the next steps are, it's very important, first and foremost, to consider risk management in general. We want to be doing risk management to stop risks from happening in the first place, or if it's opportunity, to make sure they do happen, and be prepared for it. And that includes business continuity as well. If the event still occurs, are we ready? Whether it's from a business continuity, crisis communication, pandemic, or insurance, all of these aspects need to be considered. It all falls under the risk management umbrella. Because the question is, are you ready for another lockdown? This isn't a typical business continuity scenario. Business continuity usually covers you for sort of 30 days or so. So the question is, are we ready for another lockdown? Is our business ready? What if a staff member gets ill from COVID? Do you have a pandemic plan to deal with that? And what if it's some other incident not related to the pandemic? We're seeing all the protests that are happening in America, and some of them are turning into riots. As a business, are you prepared for this? And that's where we really need to think further ahead and actually developing a risk-based strategy. So strategic planning do their thing. They develop strategies. Risk management do their thing, and they identify risk. They should be coming together to develop these risk-based strategies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Because again, as I mentioned, are you prepared for another lockdown? It's no use having good risk management if we're going to be locked down for 4 months. We can't just shut down for 4 months. We need to have a different business model that can cope with such a situation. What if social distancing lasts for another year? I think Hatsam had that as a scenario. If it lasts another year, is our current business model able to deal with that? If you're a restaurant, probably not. You're going to have to adapt your business model, whether that means moving tables out a little bit more, or maybe you open longer and you close later, and then therefore you're able to still accommodate all the numbers that you initially had. Are we prepared for an economic downturn? We heard about a possible depression. What about cancelled events? If your business is relying on a major event that's going to be happening in your country, what if that's cancelled? Is your business model able to survive that? So we'll look a lot about how we develop these risk-based strategies and plans. If we look at what is required, we're going to have to run scenario workshops. We're going to have to look at horizon scanning, assess our opportunities, review the risks to any proposed strategies we have, and provide insight into potential success. In other words, if we have a plan or strategic plan that we want to move forward with, we will probably have financials around that, and we need to understand what is the deviation that could potentially occur. Just basic deviation, but also risk-based as well. And that's where the Monte Carlo comes in. So how do we prepare for a post-COVID world? Grant has already shown us this scenario, or these various scenarios of the V-shape, the U-shape, and the new normal. And that's really where I want to focus on now. We've already discussed the fact that the lockdown has happened and we've been impacted. COVID has happened. But what is the new normal? Because our strategic plans that we are going to be developing going forward have to be based on not what used to be, but what is the new normal going to be. So therefore, we need to understand what the new normal actually is. And to do that, we need to develop scenarios. And scenarios are made up of these basic four aspects. One is identifying the driving forces. What drives our business? What are we sensitive to in the world? Then we can start looking at these critical uncertainties that are around those driving forces and develop plausible scenarios before we finally discuss how we're going to move forward, and that's your strategies. And I'll go through each of these sections or these various aspects. So identifying driving forces. Well, Hatem already highlighted a really nice model that Mazars used, the 5x5. This is a great starting point, but this is very focused on COVID-19, and we want to look a bit further on from COVID-19, not just COVID-19 specifically. So that's where horizon scanning comes in. And horizon scanning looks at identifying sector trends, country trends, regional trends, global trends, technology trends, anything that again impacts your business, that could potentially impact your business. It's understanding your vulnerabilities in relation to these trends. And this could be in the next year, COVID related, social distancing, or it could be medium term, sort of 2-3 years, or it could be longer term, 10 years. What's interesting is in the past, people used to look at a 10-year horizon and think, oh, well, in 10 years, we're going to have computers that can do X, Y, Z. What actually happened was these 10-year scenarios were actually happening in 3 years. Things are moving so quickly nowadays that actually what we think long into the future is going to happen in 10 years is actually happening much sooner. So horizon scanning just lets us start touching these pulse points. Another way we can look at this to really understand our vulnerabilities is to build a map of our organization. And in this model here that we tend to use, if this is your organization in the center, what are all the influencing factors that will impact you, whether it's planet, resources, and suppliers coming into the organization, or whether it's our clients, our consumers, are their buying habits going to change, or people that are the outputs of the organization. And then all the negative and positive risks that could potentially impact that business, whether it's new entrants to the market, new technologies, for example, competitors, partners, or counterparts. Now we want to look at the negatives pushing down against us, but the positives as well. Again, it's a good starting point for us to identify what drives our business, because then we can start looking at the critical uncertainties. And this is a very simple critical uncertainty that was highlighted earlier, the global economy. We can build 3 basic scenarios of a fast recovery, and you might find that China, for example, is a key driver in our business. We might have a lot of Chinese goods that we sell, for example, or European Union because we trade a lot with them, or America, or just globally. And we can actually have a base case, fast recovery, delayed cure, and profound recession. So these are just simple examples of what might change. And I think this is captured nicely in Mazars' free tool that was already demonstrated. You can put this kind of thing in there. The question becomes, what about when we want to take things forward and get a little bit more complex? And that's where we need to ask questions. What will a post-COVID world look like? And some key questions might be, will there be less travel? Are flights going to be expensive, or will people not feel comfortable taking flights? Or are businesses just so used to this kind of Zoom meeting that we don't need to take flights to meet face-to-face unless we know that it's critical? Will there be continued social distancing? Will there be less youth unemployment because maybe they have increased immunity whilst the more vulnerable have to stay at home? Or will there be more youth unemployment because there's going to be a huge recession? The last recession saw huge numbers of youth unemployment. How does that impact your business? Will there be more home working? People now are getting used to working from home, and they might start demanding this. If you want to employ people when things get better, a selling point might be, hey, we'll let you work from home if our business model allows it. And if it doesn't allow it, maybe we should allow it. Maybe there's an opportunity there to not have as many expensive offices in capital cities all around the world. And what about adoption of technology, robotics, AI? Is this going to change? What about reorganization of supply chain? There might be organizations that need to change their supply chain, or it might be forced due to regulation. Countries might start forcing companies to rearrange their supply chain so that we are not as vulnerable to such an event again in the future. So these are some of the questions we need to be asking. And then we can start developing our scenario. Now, this is just an example scenario. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's not based on an industry. It's just how you could look at your vulnerabilities and look at what drives our business. And for example, here on the top, we have social trust from low to high. That might be a business driver. And then we have the economy from a quick rebound to a prolonged recession. And as you can see, we have 4 scenarios here where science and tech driven is showing that virus is well controlled, the economy is strong, people crave human interaction again because we have this social trust high and a quick economy rebound. But what if there's a prolonged recession and social trust is low? We might find that fear of virus coming back drives the way we do business. Nationalistic policies, we become more insular. Industries start consolidating, digital divide grows, massive unemployment. So we can build these scenarios and plan accordingly. Now, the top and the bottom here, the 2 sides here could be talent availability. It could be technology adoption or oil price demand. If you're an organization that is dependent on oil prices or oil demand, then that might be a driver. If you're in retail or investment, if you're in property or investment, property sales might be a driver. In America, Democrat versus Republican government might be a driver. And you could build scenarios from Republican and Democrat here. And how does that impact the economy going forward? Or economy might be Brexit deals or so forth. It doesn't matter. It depends on your organization. This is why it's very important that your organization is unique and you have to do this. There's no right or wrong answer here. We can't give you a template and say, there you go. Once we understand these scenarios and we've done all this research, we can now start developing strategies. So we take these scenario plans, we take the horizon scanning, we then move that on to a joint risk and strategy development of strategic plan options before we finally create our strategic plan. Now, it might be a 2030 strategic plan, or it might be only a strategic plan for the next 2 years. It depends on your position. We already heard from Grant that Apple have a lot of money. They're going to be just fine during this current problem that we're facing. They might lose sales, but they can draw on their reserves and start purchasing all sorts of organizations that might be much cheaper. But we're not talking about Apple, we're talking about your organization. So this could be 2030, it could be 2022, it could be anything. But what's key is that risk management forms part of this process, because risk management focuses on what are the risks to the business and what are the opportunities to the business. While strategic planning as a department focus on what are our strategies, what are the options that we have, what are our objectives and plans that we're going to develop, and what are the opportunities as well. So it makes sense that these two align and combine, because we might have solutions to the risks that are identified to the business that now become a key objective to the organization. There might also be the chance for risk management and strategic planning to come together with the opportunities that we've highlighted and actually do an assessment on these opportunities. Look at the risks to the opportunities, but also, is this something that should be built into a strategic plan? Then risk management should be looking at the plans that strategic planning have come up with and look at what are the risks to those strategy options. And finally, jointly, we should be doing quantitative risk analysis on the plans. So what does that look like? So how can risk actually drive strategy? It doesn't make sense, because strategic planning usually develop a strategy and then we might look at risks. But actually, if we know we have a major risk, so let's look at these risks here. Risks of disruption from new players, risks of another lockdown, or risks of social distancing on our current business model. These are 3 risks that are going to impact the same thing. And we might be able to have a strategy solution, which is digital transformation or adoption of new technology that allows us to drive our business forward and deals with those risks. So you can see we've come up with some risks, and guess what? We now have a solution that drives our business plan. And just as an example, robotics, for example. A lot of organizations are looking at how can we introduce robotics in order to social distance. If we can now introduce robotics and social distance more, it means there's going to be less impact on our business. However, if we've decided that this is our new strategy, we're going to digitally transform our business, then we need to consider risks again. What are the potential pitfalls in this strategy? Well, the risks to this strategy would be that maybe the technology doesn't meet expectations. Maybe the robotics that we've implemented aren't as effective as we first thought. They can't replace humans. Or changes to service, our digital approach doesn't meet our customer demands or customer needs. Or the costs outweigh the benefits, or indeed, ethics. Now, I'm going to caveat something that was mentioned earlier by Hatem, which is we might go to a business and say, look, we need to cut costs and therefore we need to cut staff. But before we do that, before we just look at the financial aspect, and this is where risk management comes into play, importantly, we need to consider all the aspects of risk, including reputation. So we might move to robotics, we might move to AI, and we can cut staff, but how will that look to our customers or our shareholders or our stakeholders or to the government? We need to consider these factors because it might not be the right option. It might be a risk. So how do we manage that risk? We might still want to go that way, but we need to maybe communicate better with our staff, to our customers, as to why we're doing this. We might choose the wrong technology. For those of you who are old enough, VHS versus Betamax or HD DVD versus Blu-ray. HD DVD versus Blu-ray is the newer example, but again, even that, there might be people too young to remember that, so I don't know, but initially there was HD DVD and they were competing against Blu-ray and Blu-ray won. What if you backed the wrong one, the wrong player? And then future regulation or regulatory bans of technology. Zoom, other examples might be GoToMeetings. What happens if regulation comes in that says you cannot use this technology? We need to understand risks to help us understand the constraints and boundaries of our strategic plan. And that's not a bad thing. We need to embrace them and let them guide us because constraints drive innovation and force focus. We need to, instead of removing them, actually use them to our advantage. Risk is good. We need to take risk and we need to find innovations. And we do that by understanding what our boundaries are. So now we've done that and we've developed several strategies or one strategy. The idea is if we have several strategies, we can compare them. And if we then decide we want to continue with all these strategies, what's advantageous to having several strategies is assuming your business model can adapt and you have the resources to adapt, you will have several strategies that can be transitioned depending on what scenario plays out. We have 4 scenarios or 3 likely scenarios. We're not sure which ones are actually going to play out, but we have strategies that we can adapt to each scenario as long as we have, as I say, resources and agility to easily transition. You might have one strategy that you decide to develop that covers all of these scenarios. It might not be as effective as having several strategies, but it's probably more realistic for your business. But either way, you want to develop several strategies to compare them. And you can actually run risk-based analysis to determine the likelihood of success or the deviation from your plans so that you can better decide which one to adopt. And that's where we talk about risk-based testing of strategy. So we already saw Mazars' tool. We can actually start doing that. If you have plans, if you've developed plans, shove the financials in there, insert the new budget and populate the scenario parameters. You know you have a few different scenarios. You can start populating them in that tool and it will give you a nice, a few graphs as we saw demonstrated that give you an indication of, okay, is this going to look positive or negative and which one are we most comfortable with? Going forward as well, you could drive the what if scenarios, reduction of staff by X%, reduction of travel by X%. How does that now impact the scenario assessment? But again, as I say, it's important. This is a financial analysis. Try not to forget all the other risks around that. Damage to reputation, for example. It could actually have a more severe impact on your business. You might cut staff now, save a bit of money, but going forward, you never get those customers back that you lost who are now protesting because you cut staff. So be very careful about what you do going forward. Consider all the risks to your business. Ideally, we want to run a risk-based testing, as I mentioned, and this is where the quantitative analysis comes in. If we look at the current direction, so this would be your new strategy that you've decided on. We want to understand what happens if something good happens or something bad happens. And we can do that with the financial scenario tool from Mazars. But to take things forward in more detail using the scenarios and a risk-based approach and quantitative analysis, you can actually start looking at, well, what are the actual more likely results until you can decide what is our risk tolerance and risk appetite to these results. And that's where Monte Carlo comes into play. That's a picture of Monte Carlo, if you're unaware. I've not been, but I understand Grant has been to Monte Carlo. I would like to be, but this is where Monte Carlo simulations come from. They have a lot of casinos there, and in the casino you roll the dice, and the Monte Carlo simulation basically simulates that dice roll and gives you a curve of results. So if you have several examples of plans, if you've decided to look at 3 different plans, plan A, B, and C, you can actually compare them in terms of the upside versus the downside. You can actually then decide which one are we most comfortable with. If you look at plan C, there's far less deviation from the center, although it's not as profitable as plan A. But you might be more comfortable with plan C simply because the risk is much smaller. What's also very good about running such a Monte Carlo simulation, it can actually tell you as well which risks and which opportunities are having the biggest impact on these results. So the way you do this is you take your plan, you consider your corporate risks that risk management have identified, you consider the strategic plan risks, so what risks have come up from this specific strategic plan, and the scenario parameters, the scenarios, the 4 scenarios that you've developed. And you put them all together to run the analysis to get these results. And these results will then basically allow you to make better decisions. You'll be able to plan suitably against each scenario. So plan A might be better for this scenario, but it's not very good for that scenario. Plan B is actually quite good for all scenarios. That might be the best bet if you want to choose one plan that captures all the scenarios. But plan C might be also very good for the most likely scenarios. So maybe we want to go with plan C, but fall back onto plan A if we can. As I mentioned, it gives you the upside and downside of each plan based on various risks. Address the risks which contribute most to variability. So it might not look good now the way it is here, but you can adjust that depending on what risks have been identified. Which risks are impacting these plans the most? Maybe we need to put more money towards those plans, or we go back to the initial plan and adapt it a little bit to take out some of that risk. And now you have a much more efficient plan. And that's the what if scenarios. So if you feel that these 2 risks are very high risk, what happens if we change it? What happens if we put more money to reduce the risk? And now we can rerun the scenario and you can see, it's much less risky now. The numbers are much nicer and we've only had to spend 1 million, but the upside is 10 million. What a great way to run a cost benefit analysis instead of just guessing or just saying too much money, we don't want to spend money on that. And that's the end of my presentation. We'll have time for Q&A now.